And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. She walks along the edge of where the ocean meets the land. Not quite sea, not quite shore. The tide is rising, but she doesn't step back, not yet. This is where the maps blur, where names dissolve, where you're not who you were and not quite who you'll become. You've been here too. At the edge of a decision, a sentence unfinished, a breath you didn't take. We're taught to fear this place, to choose, to explain, to define. But what if meaning doesn't live in the naming? What if it lives in the pause? Some call it the shimmer, others the seam. Simone Weil might call it attention, the sacred weight of waiting without grasping. Merleau-Ponty would say it's where the body knows what words cannot. Keats called it negative capability, the courage to remain in doubt without reaching for reason. To some, it's the borderland. To others, it's home. This is a slow walk through that space, the one without signs, the one between the ocean and the land. It's not confusion, not avoidance. It's the threshold where clarity hasn't arrived and maybe never will. And still, something stirs. We'll move through stories, science, silence. We'll touch on how the brain begs for certainty, how culture enforces sides, how artists and mystics and lovers all live, sometimes tremble in the in-between. This isn't an argument, it's not even an answer, it's an invitation to stand in the seam, to feel what rises when you stop trying to define it, to listen and stay where the land doesn't end and the ocean hasn't fully begun. She walks along the edge of where the ocean meets the land. The sand is cool, damp beneath her feet, patterned by the memory of waves. A faint breeze lifts the edge of her coat. Nothing is still, but nothing is rushing. She moves slowly, tracing the line where things stop being one thing and start becoming another. There's no announcement when the ocean becomes the shore, no siren when the known dissolves into the unfamiliar. And yet, we treat these thresholds as if they are fixed, as if they were drawn once and forever. We long for that kind of certainty. Lines, names, answers. We're taught that clarity is safety, that to hesitate is weakness, that doubt is danger. From childhood, we are rewarded for completion. Finish the sentence, check the box, pick a side. But life doesn't always offer sides. Sometimes it gives you a moment that can't be categorized, a feeling you can't justify, a truth that won't stay still long enough to be defined. That space where the shape hasn't settled is where this begins. It's not a failure of knowledge. It's the presence of something else, something more spacious, more alive. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty described it as the flesh of the world, the place where perception and the perceived meet and blur. The writer John Keats called it negative capability, the capacity to stay in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts without the irritable reaching after fact and reason. And Simone Weil, writing from the edge of war and hunger and mysticism, believed that real attention, the purest form of love, begins when we stop trying to grasp. But this isn't a lecture, this is a walk, a movement along the unmarked, a place where language begins to stammer. You felt it. In the second before you say I love you, when you're not sure if it's true or just close enough. In the silence after someone asks, are you okay? And you don't know which version of yourself should answer. In the moment before you open a door, you're not sure you should walk through. What do we do with that space? We often try to leap past it, to categorize, resolve, close the question. But maybe it's worth staying there a little longer. Maybe meaning doesn't arrive like a verdict. Maybe it accumulates in the space where we're brave enough to not yet know. She moves through the fog without urgency, as if time itself is softened here. There is no path, no destination, only the rhythm of waves and the weight of air. Somewhere inland, people are deciding, arguing, building borders out of words and certainties. But here at the edge, nothing insists on being one thing. The world is porous, the categories loosen. Beneath her feet, the sand shifts with each step, never the same ground twice. This is not metaphor, it's fact. The earth is literally moving, adjusting itself under pressure and pull. And still we pretend it's solid, we name it, claim it, build on it. But even here, where the ocean meets the land, the illusion begins to fracture. What is held still for the sake of comfort begins to move. It's in these places, literal and imagined, that something else begins, a kind of noticing, a kind of listening that isn't about waiting for answers, but learning how to be inside the question. This is the architecture of the in-between, not empty, not undecided, but charged, full of potential, contradiction, and pulse. There's a reason this space unnerves us. The human mind is a pattern-hungry thing. It wants resolution. The neuroscientists say that ambiguity registers as a kind of threat. Our brains light up with activity trying to complete the image, close the loop. We are built to reduce uncertainty, to fit experience into legible frames, to choose, to solve, to end the sentence. And yet we don't always need to. Some of the most important moments in a life are unresolved. The silence before forgiveness, the hesitation before truth, the flicker of a choice not yet made. These are not failures of knowing, they are thresholds of becoming. The discomfort that rises in these moments is not a warning, it's a signal that we are near something real, something unprocessed, something still alive. To step into this place is to resist not only external pressures but internal ones. The pressure to be coherent, to be legible, to be right. Here, at the edge, those demands fall quiet. Here, the self becomes a more fluid thing, something that listens, adapts, absorbs. This is not a neutral space. It is not passive. It is charged with the energy of all that resists being settled. And to walk here along this shifting line is not indecision. It's its own kind of decision. To remain, to pay attention, to stay with what is not yet finished. There's a reason ambiguity makes the body tense. It's not only habit, it's hardwired. The brain seeks patterns. It builds predictions. It wants the world to make sense. And when it doesn't, we feel it in our chest, in our breath, in the tightening behind the eyes. Uncertainty registers as a kind of threat. The mind scrambles to resolve it, not always because resolution is true, but because it feels safer. Evolution rewarded this. When faced with a rustle in the grass, it was better to assume danger than to linger in doubt. We inherited that impulse, to choose quickly, to fill the silence, to draw conclusions, even when the picture is incomplete. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this the dizziness of freedom, the anxiety that arises in the face of open possibility before the self commits to a path. But the need for closure doesn't always serve us. It can rush us into false clarity. It can make us more certain than we should be. We grasp for answers not because we've earned them, but because we can't stand the weight of the question. And sometimes that grasping is what keeps us from growing. Simone Weil believed that attention, pure, open, ungrasping attention, was a form of prayer, not a reaching toward resolution, but a willingness to remain with what is unresolved. She wrote, "Waiting patiently in expectation is the foundation of the spiritual life. To sit with the not yet, the not known, and to listen without needing to possess. There is a discipline in this, a cognitive and ethical practice. To stay present in ambiguity is not passive. It is an act of resistance against the rush to define, to declare, to dismiss. It is the capacity to be in relationship with something that has not revealed itself and may never fully do so. Even our language betrays the urge for certainty. We speak in binaries, we label quickly, we demand coherence. But the self is not always coherent. It shifts, it contradicts, it doubts. To be alive is to live in flux. Merleau-Ponty suggested that perception itself is ambiguous, that the world and the body are entangled, and meaning emerges from that entanglement, not from the fixing of terms. So what if clarity isn't the final stage of knowing? What if it's just one possible moment in a larger process, preceded and followed by more honest states, confusion, curiosity, wonder? To stay in that space is to stay awake. It is to refuse the comfort of false resolution. It is to say, I do not know yet. And that too is knowledge. Some truths can't be said, not because they're secret, but because the moment they're named, they lose something. They collapse into definition, and what was alive becomes static. There are feelings, memories, instincts that live in that space, half-formed, layered, real. To speak them too soon is to simplify them. To explain them is to reduce them. Art understands this. Poetry leaves space for what can't be declared. A line breaks where meaning hesitates. Music lingers on a note that doesn't resolve. A painting smudges the boundary between figure and background, not because the artist is unsure, but because certainty would flatten what is felt. There's a story of someone who stood between two truths, equally vivid, equally incomplete. One pulled toward safety, one toward possibility. Neither was wrong, and neither was enough. And in that tension, something new appeared. Not a solution, but a shift. Not a decision, but a way of seeing. She walked forward, not because she understood, but because she could stay there no longer. Gloria Anzaldúa called this the borderland, a place where identity is plural, where language breaks and reforms, where contradictions live side by side. In this space, ambiguity is not failure. It is form. Not the absence of truth, but its unfolding. In Zen tradition, there are questions that aren't meant to be answered. Koans that are designed to short-circuit the logical mind. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Who were you before your parents were born? These aren't riddles, they're thresholds. They open something the intellect cannot cross. This is not just spiritual metaphor, it's a psychological reality. To hold contradiction without collapsing into resolution is a rare capacity. It asks us to be honest about what we don't know. It asks us to let two things be true at once. The self that loves and doubts, the memory that soothes and stings, the longing to stay and the need to leave. Kierkegaard believed the self is a paradox, something that relates to itself by being divided. A tension we live with, not one we solve. And maybe that's what it means to be whole, not to resolve every contradiction, but to stop demanding they disappear. We rush to reconcile, to clean up the mess, but the mess might be the point. The unresolved might be the most real thing we have, not because it gives us answers, but because it refuses to lie, because it holds what clarity can't, because it lets us stay human. Touch is a border. Skin, the first and last boundary. It marks where you end and something else begins, or so we're taught. But even here, at the level of the body, the lines don't hold. Skin breathes, it absorbs, exchanges, translates. It holds memory, carries trauma, registers emotion before the mind can catch up. You blush before you speak, you flinch before you know why. The body responds to what language cannot yet name. Stand in water and feel how the body forgets its edges. The warmth moves in, the tide laps at your legs, the boundary dissolves. Not gone, but softened. What if that's not loss, but knowledge? What if understanding happens here, in sensation, not sentence? The philosopher Merleau-Ponty believed perception is never neutral. The world is not just observed, it's lived. The body doesn't interpret the world from the outside. It is in the world, tangled with it. Knowing is not about stepping back, it's about stepping in. You understand something not by naming it, but by being touched by it. Breath, too, teaches this. The inhale is not possession, the exhale is not release. There is no final arrival, only movement, a rhythm of coming close and letting go. The moment you try to hold it, it changes, and yet we breathe every day, trusting that the next breath will come, even if we don't control it. There's a wisdom in that. In ritual, we often find the same structure, not instruction, but invitation. Not definition, but enactment, lighting a candle, washing the hands, chanting words we may not understand. These actions do not explain. They express, they carry knowledge that moves through the body, not the intellect. We often dismiss the sensory as simple, primitive, less than the rational. But what if it's deeper? What if it holds truths we cannot reach with thought alone? The moment before touch, the quiet before music, the light just before dusk. These are not delays. They are events, they are knowledge in motion. And in that space, where the body meets the world without needing to conquer it, another kind of meaning begins. One that doesn't ask to be translated. One that doesn't need to be solved. The hand resting on a shoulder, the taste of salt in the air, the warmth of skin, not as message, but as presence. This is the knowing that lives between, not as metaphor, but as flesh. Ambiguity isn't always a gift. It can confuse, it can harm. Not every blurred line is gentle. Some are drawn that way on purpose, to protect power, to avoid responsibility, to excuse violence. The space between can be a refuge, but it can also be a shield. History is full of this. Politicians who speak in riddles to hide intent. Institutions that claim neutrality while enacting harm. Tech platforms that refuse accountability, insisting they're just the infrastructure. Ambiguity becomes a tactic, not of openness, but of evasion. The middle ground becomes a fog where no one is held accountable and nothing has to change. There are moments when clarity is necessary, when a line must be drawn, when silence is complicity, when not choosing is a choice and not speaking is a statement. Ambiguity can be a kind of luxury, available to those who won't suffer its consequences. The philosopher Judith Butler has spoken about opacity as resistance, but also as risk. Not all ambiguity is subversive. Sometimes it protects the status quo. Sometimes it obscures the truth we urgently need. Sometimes clarity is care. So how do we know the difference? How do we tell when staying in between is an act of depth and when it's avoidance? It comes down to relationship, to awareness, to intention. Ambiguity that invites connection, complexity, vulnerability, that's one thing. But ambiguity that clouds power, that avoids responsibility, that denies the reality of others, that's another. The same threshold that invites mystery can also hide abuse. And so this walk between the ocean and the land must be taken with discernment. This is not an escape from ethics, it is a deepening of them, a commitment to stay in the tension with others, to hold complexity without erasing harm, to remain open, not aimless, present, not evasive. There is such a thing as false nuance, the kind that flattens difference into sameness, that says it's all complicated when what it really means is I refuse to take a stand. But nuance, at its best, is not the absence of truth. It is its texture, its depth. It's what allows us to speak clearly and feel fully, to name injustice and remain human. So no, this isn't a hymn to vagueness. It's a defense of a different kind of clarity, one that includes contradiction, one that lives in friction, one that doesn't fear being unfinished as long as it stays in relationship with what's real. Still, something in us longs to remain. Not because the in-between is safe, but because it's alive, because it breathes, because there are truths that only appear when we stop trying to control the shape they take. What if the refusal to resolve is its own kind of wisdom? Mystics have always known this. The desert fathers, the Zen poets, the Sufi dancers, none of them sought answers in the conventional sense. They stayed with the trouble. They circled the silence. They made homes inside of questions, trusting that something sacred could arise not from what was concluded, but from what was endured. To dwell in ambiguity consciously is not to drift, it is to stay attentive, to remain in relationship with complexity without forcing it into coherence. It is a discipline, a radical kind of patience. Not passive, but deeply alert. Donna Haraway calls this staying with the trouble. Not solving it, not transcending it, but sitting beside it long enough for it to transform. This isn't a call to comfort. It's a call to intimacy, with the unknown, with ourselves, with one another. And it's not theoretical. There are people living this every day. The parent who loves a child whose path they don't understand. The friend who stays close through someone else's grief without needing to fix it. The artist who paints into the mess, not around it. The body that learns to live with both longing and loss without asking for resolution. To embrace this way of being is to risk something. Certainty is easier to defend. Answers are easier to market. But staying open is a form of resistance. It says, I'm not here to consume meaning. I'm here to co-create it, slowly, imperfectly, with care. And something happens in that space. When we stop grasping for clarity, a different kind of insight arrives. Not loud, not total, but real, like light shifting across a surface. Like music that doesn't resolve, but still satisfies. This is not indecision. This is devotion. Devotion to complexity, to depth, to the shimmering places between identities, between beliefs, between the stories we've been told and the ones we're still writing. It doesn't mean we don't act. It means we act with humility, with curiosity, with the knowledge that sometimes the most honest thing we can do is remain unfinished. Not as failure, but as faith. She walks where the land begins to vanish. The line between solid and shifting has faded, but her steps are steady. There is no arrival here, only presence. The tide moves in, then out. The light changes. The silence grows. There is nothing left to explain. All along this path, the promise was never resolution. It was contact, with uncertainty, with breath, with the truth that not everything that matters can be named. We spend our lives trying to know. But there is also knowing in not knowing, a wisdom that pulses beneath the reach of language. Perhaps this is what Merleau-Ponty meant, that the body understands things the mind cannot, that there is perception in stillness, that to be touched by the world is a form of comprehension, even when we can't describe it. Here at the edge, clarity is not what appears. What appears is something else. The willingness to listen without rushing to interpret, to witness without reducing, to feel without needing a conclusion. This is where the voice quiets. because some places ask not to be narrated but noticed, because some moments are not meant to be closed. You've stood here before, in the dim before a confession, in the breath before a leap, in the pause before saying I don't know. And maybe, just maybe, that not knowing is holy, not because it offers safety, but because it makes space for another beginning, for a deeper kind of truth. For whatever it is that lives quietly, insistently between the ocean and the land. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform